The island rises out of the eastern Indian Ocean like a locked door. From above, it looks almost peaceful. A dark green oval of forest, a pale ring of sand, and around it a broken necklace of coral reef where the sea turns from deep blue to dangerous turquoise. But the closer a boat comes, the less inviting it becomes. The reef can tear open a hull. The surf can throw a landing craft sideways. The forest begins almost immediately beyond the beach, dense enough to swallow movement after only a few steps. And somewhere behind that wall of trees are people who have made one thing clear for generations: this place is not open to the world. North Sentinel Island is not large. It is not rich in obvious resources. It has no known cities, no visible temples, no written monuments, no ruins standing in the sun to announce an ancient past. Yet it holds one of the most extraordinary human stories still unfolding on Earth, a small community that has survived in isolation, or something close to isolation, while empires, religions, markets, navies, colonies, nation-states, and satellites have passed around it. The modern world can photograph the island from space, draw a boundary around it on a map, and patrol the waters nearby, but it cannot truly enter. The people there remain among the least contacted human communities known today, not because they are frozen in time, but because they have defended the right to remain outside the reach of strangers. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. What makes the story so powerful is not simply that the Sentinelese are isolated. Isolation alone can be misunderstood. It is easy to imagine them as relics, as if they belong to some earlier age preserved under glass. That picture is wrong. They are not living fossils. They are living people, making choices in the present, responding to danger, using knowledge inherited and adapted over countless generations. What survives in the record suggests a community deeply familiar with its island, its reef, its weather, its food sources, and its risks. Outsiders often see absence: no roads, no ports, no metal industry visible from the beach, no diplomatic contact, no census, no dictionary, no permission to study. But absence on an outsider's map is not the same as emptiness. It may be the sign of a world organized by rules the outsider does not know. North Sentinel sits in the Andaman Archipelago, a chain of islands between the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea. This is a region shaped by tectonic violence, monsoon winds, reefs, mangroves, and deep channels. It lies closer to Southeast Asia than to mainland India in cultural and geographic feeling, though today it is administered by India as part of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Ships have crossed these waters for centuries, and perhaps for far longer than written records can show. Traders, sailors, colonizers, convicts, fishermen, officials, missionaries, anthropologists, and naval crews have all passed through the wider island world. Some islands were transformed beyond recognition. Populations were devastated by disease and displacement. Forests were cleared. Ports were built. Prisons rose. Roads cut across old homelands. But North Sentinel remained different, not untouched in a magical sense, but unabsorbed. The island's reputation among outsiders often begins with arrows. A helicopter comes too close, and arrows rise from the beach. A boat drifts onto the reef, and armed men appear at the shore. Contact parties arrive with coconuts or gifts, and the response shifts unpredictably between watchfulness, warning, and attack. The evidence remains incomplete, because nearly everything known from outside comes from brief encounters observed at a distance. But those encounters have built a pattern. The Sentinelas do not welcome landing. They do not consent to being studied. They do not allow strangers to turn their home into a laboratory, a mission field, or an adventure. To many people, that refusal feels mysterious. To the Sentinelese, it may be nothing of the kind. History gives them many reasons to distrust visitors. Across the Andaman Islands, outside contact brought catastrophe. Indigenous communities suffered from introduced diseases, colonial violence, abductions, forced relocations, dependency, and the slow destruction of old ways of life. No single explanation fully accounts for the Sentinelese position, because their own account is unknown to outsiders, but from the visible pattern alone, their defense of distance is not irrational, it is practical. In a world where a common cold can be dangerous to an isolated population, where curiosity can become invasion, where rescue can become capture, distance itself becomes a survival tool. The first surprise of North Sentinel is that its people are not cut off from nature's violence. Their island is not a safe paradise. It sits in a region of cyclones, heavy rains, salt winds, earthquakes, and tsunamis. The forest may provide food and material, but it also hides dangers and limits movement. The reef may offer fish and shellfish, but it also makes approach treacherous and can become deadly in rough seas. Fresh water must be found and protected. Small populations face risks that large societies barely notice: illness, injury, storm damage, food shortage, conflict, and the constant problem of maintaining enough people for the next generation. Scholars still debate details of their population, language, and long-term history. Because direct evidence is scarce and ethical limits now prevent intrusive research, yet the central fact remains astonishing. They are still there. To survive on such an island is to know it with an intimacy no visitor can acquire in an afternoon. The shape of the shore matters. The timing of tides matters. The behavior of birds, turtles, fish, crabs, and pigs matters. The seasons matter. The location of trees, vines, honey, tubers, and fresh water matters. A storm does not arrive as a line on a weather chart. It arrives as pressure in the air, changes in the sea, cloud forms, animal movement, and memory. A reef is not scenery. It is a pantry, a trap, a road, and a wall. Outsiders look at North Sentinel and ask how anyone could live there. The better question may be how much knowledge it takes to make such a place livable. There is also the question of time. How long have the Sentinelas been there? The answer is not simple. They're usually discussed in relation to the broader indigenous peoples of the Andaman Islands, whose ancestry may reach far back into the deep human past. Genetic, linguistic, and archaeological evidence in the wider region has been interpreted in different ways, and scholars remain cautious. It is not accurate to say with certainty that the Sentinelese have lived unchanged for tens of thousands of years. That claim is too neat, too tempting, and too unsupported. But it is reasonable to say that the Andaman peoples represent ancient lines of human settlement in island Southeast Asia and the eastern Indian Ocean, and that North Sentinel may preserve one of the most isolated continuities of human life known today. The island therefore becomes more than a place. It becomes a boundary between knowledge and restraint. Modern history is often told as expansion, exploration, mapping, discovery, connection. The blank spaces are filled. The remote becomes reachable. The unknown becomes data. But North Sentinel resists that story. It forces a different kind of historical imagination, one that accepts that not every mystery should be solved by entry. Not every culture should be translated for outsiders. and not every surviving people from the deep human past owes the world an explanation. From the beach, if one could stand there without danger and without trespass, the view would not show a lost civilization in ruins. It would show smoke, perhaps, movement between trees, canoes pulled above the tide, bows in hand, people watching. The mystery is not whether they are human like everyone else. Of course they are. The mystery is how a small society has endured at the edge of storms, empires, disease, and obsession, in a place many outsiders imagine no human should live at all. The protection around North Sentinel does not begin with law, it begins with water. Long before patrol boats, exclusion zones, and government orders, the island sits behind a natural defence system built by geology and time. The sea around it is not an empty blue road. It is layered with reefs, currents, shallows, sudden depth changes, and seasonal moods that punish carelessness. A ship can see the island and still fail to reach it. A boat can cross many miles of open water only to find that the last few hundred meters are the most dangerous part of the journey. The island does not need walls in the human sense, because the ocean has already made one. From a distance, coral reef looks beautiful. From the point of view of a landing party, it is a problem. Reefs can hide under water bright enough to dazzle the eye. Waves break over them in irregular lines. Passages shift with tide and weather. A small mistake can strand a vessel, split planks, or force people into the surf. This matters because most outsiders who came near North Sentinel were not arriving with the careful patience of people who belonged there. They came in boats built for other waters, guided by charts made from the imperfect surveys, driven by curiosity, command, rescue, mission, or accident. The Sentinelese, by contrast, appear to understand the reef as part of their living world. What looks like a barrier to strangers may also be a familiar edge, a hunting ground, a warning system, and a shield. The island itself is low and forested, without the towering mountain profile that makes some islands visible from great distances. It does not announce itself like a volcanic cone. It waits close to sea level, wrapped in green. That low shape has consequences. Storm surge and tsunami waves can cross low coastal zones with frightening force, and the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami later proves how vulnerable the region can be. But the same low, reef-ringed form also makes ordinary landing difficult. There are beaches, but beaches are not invitations. They are exposed strips between surf and forest, places where anyone stepping ashore becomes visible almost immediately. There is little room for an outsider to arrive unnoticed. This geography shapes history before recorded history begins. Islands are often imagined as isolated by default, but many islands are deeply connected. Across the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asian seas, people have moved by boat for thousands of years. Languages, crops, animals, metals, religions, and stories have crossed water again and again. The Andaman Islands sit not in a forgotten corner, but near old maritime routes linking South Asia and Southeast Asia. Yet connection is not uniform. Some coasts become harbours, some channels become highways, some islands become stepping stones, others remain avoided because they are hard to approach, hard to settle, or already defended. North Sentinel belongs to this last category. Its isolation is not merely distance, it is selective difficulty. The wider Andaman archipelago is itself a world of edges. Dense forests, mangroves, creeks, beaches, and reefs divide human movement into small zones of familiarity. One island can be near another and still feel separated by currents, language, custom, and danger. In such a landscape, human societies may develop with intense local knowledge and strong boundaries. The sea connects, but it also divides. A canoe can cross water, yet not every crossing is safe, desirable, or permitted. What survives in the record suggests that many Andamanese groups maintain distinct territories and identities. North Sentinel's people may be part of that broader pattern, though their specific language and history remain unknown. The evidence remains incomplete, and the island itself refuses the kind of direct study that would make neat answers possible. The reef also helps explain why North Sentinel could remain outside Empire for so long. Empires prefer ports, anchorages, predictable channels, and supply points. They prefer places where ships can land goods, soldiers, missionaries, administrators, and laws. North Sentinel offers little of that. It is too small to become an obvious colonial prize, too difficult to approach casually, and too dangerous to occupy without a level of effort that few outsiders saw as worthwhile. That may sound like a minor detail, but history often turns on such practical things. A coastline that welcomes ships is transformed quickly. A coastline that breaks them can preserve distance for centuries. The monsoon adds another layer. In this region, wind and rain are not background atmosphere. They are historical forces. Seasonal winds determine when boats travel safely, when seas become rough, when beaches change, when fishing patterns shift, and when the forest produces different foods. For people living on the island, seasonal rhythm becomes part of survival. For strangers, it becomes uncertainty. A landing that seems possible in one season may be reckless in another. A passage through reef may vanish under rough water. A calm approach may turn dangerous before departure. Outsiders often underestimate such details because maps flatten them. A map gives the island a clean outline. The sea gives it a temper. There is a lesser-known point hidden in this geography. Isolation does not always mean ignorance of outsiders. A community can reject contact while still knowing that outsiders exist. The Sentinel is almost certainly sea aircraft, boats, distant lights, and debris from the outside world. They have recovered metal from shipwrecks and used it, at least in limited ways, for tools or weapons. This detail matters because it breaks the simple myth of a people sealed away in total innocence. Their island is remote, but it is not outside history. Objects arrive, strangers appear, threats return, choices are made. The boundary is maintained not by lack of awareness, but by active refusal. That refusal is supported by the landscape. The dense forest begins as a second wall behind the reef and beach. Tropical forest can make a small island feel much larger than it is. Visibility narrows. Paths are known only to those who use them. Sound carries strangely. A person unfamiliar with the interior can become lost or exposed very quickly. For the Sentinelese, the forest is likely home ground in every sense: shelter, food source, material storehouse, and memory map. For outsiders, it is a place of uncertainty. Even if a landing succeeded, it would not mean control. The island's interior would remain difficult to read. North Sentinel therefore survives inside a set of overlapping defences: reef, surf, forest, weather, distance, and human determination. None of these alone is enough to explain the island's history. Many reef islands have been colonised. Many forested places have been invaded. Many remote communities have been pulled into wider systems by force, trade, disease, or dependency. No single explanation fully accounts for North Sentinel's endurance. But together, these factors form a powerful pattern. The island is not unreachable. It is reachable only at cost, and for most of history that cost has been high enough to matter. There is something almost unsettling about this. Modern people are used to thinking of geography as defeated. Mountains have tunnels, deserts have roads, oceans have shipping lanes, satellites see through distance, phones collapse space into signals. But around North Sentinel, distance still behaves like distance. The last mile still matters. The surf still matters. The choice of the people on the shore still matters. A helicopter can hover above the trees, but it cannot turn observation into understanding. A camera can capture figures on a beach, but it cannot translate their language, their memories, or their reasons. So the island's wall of time is not a single ancient event. It is a process repeated every day. Waves continue to break on the reef. Forest continues to close behind the beach. Outsiders continue to wonder. The sentinels continue to watch the horizon. And between those two worlds lies the same bright, dangerous water that has always made approach possible only in the most limited sense. Before ancestry, before colonial records, before modern laws, before the famous encounters that made the island known around the world, there is this first fact: North Sentinel is a place where geography itself teaches caution. The deeper story of North Sentinel begins before the island has a name on any outside map, before survey ships mark its reefs, before officials debate contact policies, and before the modern world learns to speak of it as forbidden. It begins in a much older human landscape, when sea levels, coastlines, forests, and migration routes do not look exactly as they do today. The people of North Sentinel are known to outsiders only in glimpses, but they belong to the wider human story of the Andaman Islands, and that story reaches back into a past where evidence is rare, fragile, and easy to oversimplify. The Andaman Islands lie along one of the great old zones of human movement, tens of thousands of years ago. Modern humans were spreading through southern Asia and eventually into island Southeast Asia and Australia. Coastlines were different then. During colder periods of the Ice Age, more water was locked in ice sheets, and sea levels were lower. Shores that are now drowned may once have been beaches, wetlands, river mouths, and stepping stones for people moving along the edges of the sea. Much of the archaeological record of those movements may now lie underwater, erased or hidden beneath later oceans. This is one reason scholars still debate the timing and nature of early settlement in many island regions. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Sometimes the old world has simply sunk. The indigenous peoples of the Andamans have often been described as among the descendants of very ancient human populations, but this idea must be handled carefully. It does not mean they are unchanged remnants of the Stone Age. It does not mean they stand closer to some original form of humanity than anyone else. Every living people has a history. Every population changes. Languages shift. Tools change. Marriages happen. Conflicts occur. Memories are remade. And environments demand adaptation. What survives in the record suggests deep continuity in the Andaman Islands. But continuity is not the same as stillness. The Sentinelese, like all people, live in time. Because direct research on North Sentinel is ethically and practically limited, much of what is said about their ancestry comes from comparison with other Andamanese groups, such as the Great Andamanese peoples, the Ong, the Jarawa, and others known through colonial records, modern studies, and surviving communities. These comparisons are useful but imperfect. Neighbouring peoples can share ancient roots and still differ profoundly in language, custom, territory, and experience. The Sentinelist language remains unclassified because outsiders do not understand it, and known Andamanese languages do not simply unlock it. Even brief attempts at communication with neighbouring Andamanese interpreters reportedly failed to produce clear mutual understanding. That small fact carries a large warning. Proximity is not sameness. There is a temptation to imagine one original migration, one founding group, one moment when people first stepped onto North Sentinel and stayed. The reality is probably more complicated. Islands can be settled, abandoned, resettled, visited, raided, avoided, remembered, and forgotten over long periods. Canoes can cross channels, storms can force landings, marriage networks or conflict may once have linked islands that later became separated. Sea level changes can alter the difficulty of travel. The evidence remains incomplete, and North Sentinel does not offer archaeologists open sites to excavate. So the first human footprints there are not preserved in a neat trail. They are inferred from broader patterns, the ancient presence of humans in the Andamans, the island's habitable resources, and the continued existence of a community whose roots must reach back far beyond written history. The Andamanese peoples became famous in older anthropology for physical traits that outsiders grouped under crude and outdated racial categories. Those classifications now say more about the history of anthropology than about the people themselves. Modern understanding is more cautious. Human populations are not museum types. They are branches of a constantly moving, mixing, adapting species. Genetic studies of Andamanese groups have been used to explore ancient population history. But even genetics cannot tell the full human story. It can suggest relationships and deep separations. It cannot describe songs, grief, humour, law, fear, or the memory of a storm, for the Sentinelis especially, who have not consented to such study. The most important fact may be the limit itself. Some knowledge is not ours to take. Still, the survival of small island peoples in the Andamans reveals something remarkable about human adaptability. The first people who reached these islands had to understand coast and forest together. They were not farmers in the usual sense, and there is no evidence that the Sentineles practice agriculture as outsiders define it. Their survival appears to depend on hunting, gathering, fishing, and foraging along an unusually rich boundary between land and sea. Such a life requires precision. It is not a simple life in the sense of being easy. It is a complex knowledge system without writing, a map carried in practice rather than paper. A person must know what can be eaten, what must be avoided, where animals move, how tides expose food, which wood bends for a bow, which fibres hold, when honey can be taken, how wounds are treated, how children learn danger, and how far a canoe may safely go. A lesser-known detail about the wider Andamanese world is that fire, material culture, and island ecology created very specific patterns of living. Some Andamanese groups historically used fire carefully, but did not necessarily produce it easily in every circumstance, preserving embers and transporting them. Tools could be made from shell, bone, wood, stone, and later scavenged metal. On North Sentinel, outsiders have observed the use of metal taken from wrecks, shaped into arrowheads or other objects. This shows adaptation without surrender. The arrival of outside material did not automatically pull the island into outside society. A piece of iron could be absorbed into Sentinelese life, while the people who made that iron remained unwanted. That distinction is important because it undermines one of the most persistent myths about isolated peoples, that contact is inevitable once a more technologically complex object appears. History does not work so neatly. People adopt what is useful and reject what is dangerous all the time. The Sentinelis may use metal without accepting visitors, just as other societies have borrowed crops, animals, weapons, or words without giving up their boundaries. Technology does not erase sovereignty. A steel-tipped arrow made from salvage material can be both a tool of adaptation and a statement of refusal. The first human presence on North Sentinel may have been shaped by necessity, accident, or choice. Perhaps ancestors reached the island from elsewhere in the Andamans when sea conditions, population pressures, or social divisions made movement possible. Perhaps the island was part of a wider network that later narrowed. Perhaps its people have maintained some memory of outsiders, not as a surprise but as a recurring danger. No single explanation fully accounts for what little can be seen from the outside. But the simplest assumption may be this: they are there because generations before them found ways to make the island livable, and because later generations found reasons to remain apart. In the long story of humanity, the Sentinelists are often described by what they lack: writing, cities, agriculture, metalworking, treaties, census records, public history. But this is an outsider's inventory. It measures them against the tools of states and empires, not against the demands of their own world. Measured against the island, the picture changes. They have endured storms, hunger, injuries, demographic risk, and the repeated appearance of strangers whose intentions were often impossible to know. They have preserved a community in a place where a single epidemic could be disastrous. They have maintained language, childhood, memory, and defense across generations. That is not absence, that is achievement. So the first footprints on North Sentinel are not only archaeological, they are philosophical. They force a question about what counts as history. If there are no inscriptions, no kings, no monuments, no chronicles, does the past become smaller, or does it simply become harder for outsiders to hear? The island suggests the second answer. History is present in the placement of a canoe, in the clearing of a path, in the aim of an arrow, in the memory of where the reef breaks safely, in the decision to keep strangers at the edge of the surf. Long before the island enters written records, it is already full of human time. To understand how anyone survives on North Sentinel, the island has to stop being a symbol and become a place again. Not the forbidden island of headlines, not the last uncontacted tribe of popular imagination, not a blank green patch on satellite images, but a lived landscape of heat, shade, hunger, skill, habit, and memory. The Sentinelists do not survive there because the island is easy. They survive because they know how to read it. Every society has its own library. Some libraries are made of paper, others are carried in the body and the hand that chooses one tree over another, in the eye that notices a change in the tide, in the child who learns where not to step, in the elder who remembers what happened when the sea once behaved strangely. North Sentinel offers several worlds pressed tightly together. There is the beach, open and bright, where the sea leaves shells, driftwood, turtle tracks, and sometimes the wreckage of distant human economies. There is the reef, dangerous to boats, but rich with food for those who know its moods. There is the forest, dense and humid, where the visible path of an outsider may end almost immediately, but where residents likely know routes, resources, camps, clearings, and seasonal signs. There may be freshwater sources hidden under vegetation or collected in ways outsiders have rarely observed. There are pigs, birds, fish, crabs, mollusks, roots, fruits, honey, and the countless small materials from which a life can be built. None of these things alone guarantees survival. The achievement lies in the relationships among them. A small island society cannot treat food as an abstract resource. It must understand timing. Some foods appear briefly and then vanish. Some are abundant but difficult to collect. Some require cooperation. Some are risky. A reef flat exposed at low tide may provide shellfish, crabs, octopus, or trapped fish. But the same place under a rising tide can become hazardous. Forest hunting may bring meat, but hunting too much in a small ecosystem can damage the future. Honey may be valuable, but bees defend it. Turtles may come ashore, but not every beach and not every season offers the same chance. What survives in the record suggests that the Sentinellas use both forest and shore, which means their economy is not simply jungle survival or sea survival. It is the art of moving between zones without exhausting them. This is one of the lesser-known strengths of many hunter-gatherer and foraging societies. Their lives can look materially simple, while their ecological knowledge is extremely detailed. Outsiders often mistake the absence of permanent architecture for the absence of planning. But a house built lightly in a tropical environment may be a rational choice, not a failure to invent stone walls, a camp that can shift after storms, social tension, food movement, or seasonal change may be better suited to the island than a fixed settlement in the wrong place. A canoe that stays near the reef rather than crossing open ocean may not reveal ignorance of navigation. It may reveal a careful understanding of what the local sea allows and what it punishes. The Sentinella's canoes seen by outsiders appear relatively simple, often described as narrow dugouts or small craft used in shallow waters. They are not built like deep-sea vessels, and observers have suggested they are propelled with poles rather than large paddles in some contexts. That detail is easy to underrate. A canoe does not need to cross the ocean to be important. In a reef environment, a shallow craft can open access to food, movement, and defense. It can allow people to move along the coast, reach reef pools, collect marine resources, and monitor the edge of their territory. It is a tool designed for a specific world. The fact that it may be poorly suited for long voyages says little about its brilliance within the reef. The island's forest also supplies more than food. It supplies materials for bows, arrows, shelters, baskets, cords, handles, firewood, and perhaps medicines known only through practice. A bow is not merely a weapon, it is a relationship among wood, string, hand, training, and target. Arrows can be made for different purposes, and reports from contact attempts suggest the sentinels have used arrows with skill and confidence. Some arrowheads may include scavenged metal from shipwrecks, while others may rely on local materials. Here again, adaptation appears without dependence. The island takes from the world what the sea delivers, but it does not open itself to the world that made those objects. A society of this kind depends heavily on teaching. Children must learn danger before danger kills them. They must learn food before hunger weakens them. They must learn territory before they wander into risk. They must learn who belongs, who does not, and how to respond when the horizon brings strangers. Much of this learning would not look like formal instruction to an outsider. It would happen through imitation, correction, participation, story, and repeated movement through the landscape. The evidence remains incomplete, because outsiders cannot observe daily life closely without violating the very boundaries that protect it. But no community survives for generations in such a place without strong systems of knowledge transfer. The social side of survival may be even more important than the ecological side. A small population has little margin for breakdown. Cooperation matters. Conflict must be managed somehow. Marriages, kinship obligations, childcare, food sharing, injury care, and decisions about movement all shape whether the group endures. Outsiders know almost nothing about sentineless kinship, leadership, ritual, or belief. It is not even clear how many people live on the island, and estimates vary widely. Scholars still debate the size and structure of the population because distance makes certainty impossible. Yet the continued presence of children in some observations suggests not just survival, but reproduction, family life, and continuity. That point deserves attention. Popular accounts often reduce the sentinelist to armed men on a beach, but a society is not made only of defenders. Somewhere beyond those brief scenes are infants, mothers, grandparents, siblings, people recovering from illness, people preparing food, people sleeping through rain, people repairing tools, people grieving, people laughing, people aging. The camera catches confrontation because confrontation happens at the edge where outsiders appear. It does not catch the ordinary life that makes defense meaningful. The arrows are not the culture, they are the border. The island's carrying capacity must also be limited. North Sentinel is not a continent. If the population grows too large, pressure on food and fresh water could rise. If it falls too low, genetic and social risks increase. In small communities, a storm, epidemic, or accident can have consequences that echo for generations. No single explanation fully accounts for how the Sentinelese have navigated this vulnerability, but their endurance suggests a long history of balance. Whether through birth spacing, mobility, resource management, social rules, or other practices outsiders do not understand, the mystery is not that they lack modern systems. The mystery is how many systems they must have that outsiders cannot see. There is also the question of health. Isolation protects against some dangers and creates others. It may reduce exposure to outside diseases, but it does not eliminate injury, infection, parasites, childbirth risks, or nutritional stress. Without modern medicine, survival depends on prevention, care, plant knowledge, immune history, and luck. The danger from outsiders is especially severe because isolated populations may have little immunity to common pathogens. A visitor who feels perfectly healthy could carry a virus that becomes catastrophic. This is why modern protective policies emphasize distance. Contact is not just a cultural intrusion. It can be biological violence, even when no violence is intended. The Sentinelese way of life is sometimes described as primitive, a word that reveals more about the speaker than about the island. A more accurate word is specialized. Their tools, movements, and boundaries are specialized for North Sentinel. They do not need to solve the problems of cities, highways, stock markets, or written bureaucracy. They need to solve the problems of reef, forest, weather, food, injury, memory, and strangers. In those terms, their society has performed with extraordinary success. It has lasted where many larger, richer, better documented societies have collapsed. Seen this way, the island is not a place where no human should live. It is a place where humans can live only if they belong to a deep chain of knowledge. A stranger arriving with machines may be less capable there than a child raised among the trees. The modern world often assumes that technology means mastery, but mastery is always local. On North Sentinel, a satellite phone is useless if the surf flips the boat. A map is useless if it cannot show where the reef cuts feet at low tide. A medical kit is useless if its owner is not allowed ashore. The people who live there possess the only technology that truly fits the island inherited attention. And so life without the world is not life without history, intelligence, or change. It is life with a different center. The world beyond the reef may be vast, loud, and powerful, but it is not necessary to every human story. For the Sentinelles, the centre is the island itself, the reef line flashing under the sun, the forest darkening after rain, the small canoe moving through shallow water, the watched horizon, the remembered danger. Outsiders may call it isolation. From inside, it may simply be home. The sea around North Sentinel is not merely a boundary. It is the island's second body. It feeds the people, warns them, blocks strangers, carries danger, and sometimes throws pieces of the outside world onto the reef like offerings from a civilization that cannot quite get in. To outsiders, the ocean looks like the thing separating the Sentinelles from everyone else. To the people on the island, it may be something more complicated, a road they choose carefully, a hunting ground they understand intimately, and a fortress that works only because they know how to live with it. A reef is never just a line. It is a changing field of depth, colour, current, and sound. At low tide, parts of it may expose pools where fish are trapped and shellfish cling to rock. At high tide, the same place becomes a submerged maze. Wind can turn safe shallows into breaking water. Rain can change visibility. A moon phase can alter the timing of movement. For someone born into that world, the reef is read almost like a text. For an outsider, it is a beautiful hazard. This difference matters because the sentinelless defense of their island does not rely only on weapons. It relies on a symmetry. They know the ground and water. Strangers do not. Small canoes seen near North Sentinel appear adapted to this shallow, reef-bound world. They're not evidence of oceanic wandering. They're evidence of precision, a craft that seems limited from the perspective of long-distance navigation may be perfectly suited for slipping over lagoon water, moving along the coast, reaching fishing spots, or approaching a stranded object before the sea destroys it. The Sentinelese do not need ships to make the ocean useful. They need craft that match the reef, and what survives in the record suggests they have exactly that. The sea gives food, but not freely. Fish must be caught. Shellfish must be collected at the right time. Crabs must be handled. Turtles may appear seasonally, and their eggs may be known to those who watch beaches closely. Even drift material has value. Wood, plastic, metal, rope, and other debris from the outside world can arrive without permission. The most famous example is metal, especially from wrecks. For people without known smelting or mining, salvaged iron can become extremely valuable. It can be hammered, sharpened, reused, and fitted into existing tool traditions. This is one of the quiet contradictions at the heart of North Sentinel. The tribe rejects outsiders, but not necessarily every object the outside world loses. That distinction reveals intelligence, not inconsistency. Human societies have always borrowed selectively. A useful material can be accepted without accepting the people who brought it. The Sentinelese can turn a piece of wreckage into an arrowhead while still refusing the ship's world. They can incorporate the sea's accidents into island life without becoming dependent on trade. Scholars still debate how much outside material has influenced their tools over time, because observation is limited, but the pattern is clear enough to matter. Isolation is not purity. It is control over the terms of encounter. The ocean also allows the sentinelist to see danger before it arrives. A boat cannot simply appear in the village centre. It must cross open water, approach the reef, make noise, show itself, and slow down. That gives time. People can gather, weapons can be prepared, children can be moved away. Men and women may take different roles, though outsiders know too little to describe them with confidence. The beach becomes a threshold where the island decides whether to tolerate, warn, or repel. In many recorded encounters, the Sentinels have used the shoreline as a stage of refusal. They do not need to explain themselves in a language outsiders understand. The message is delivered through posture, movement, distance, and arrows. This defensive relationship with the sea likely has deep roots. In island worlds, strangers often arrive by water. Gifts arrive by water. Disease arrives by water. Violence arrives by water. The same horizon that brings fish and driftwood can also bring catastrophe. Across the wider Andamans, colonial contact showed how dangerous that horizon could be. Even if the Sentinels do not preserve those events in a form outsiders can know, their own experience of visitors has given them reasons to be cautious. Some outsiders came to observe, some to rescue, some to convert, some by accident, and some without understanding the risks they created. From the island's point of view, the difference may not matter. A stranger on the reef is still a stranger. There is a lesser-known kind of survival hidden here, the ability to keep a border legible across generations. Children must learn not only how to fish and forage, but how to interpret approach. A distant boat, a low-flying aircraft, an object drifting in, a person waving from the surf, a helicopter hovering after a disaster, all these require responses. The Sentinelese appear to have maintained a clear social memory that outsiders are not to be trusted inside the boundary. The evidence remains incomplete, but the consistency of refusal over many decades suggests more than momentary fear. It suggests a cultural rule, repeatedly taught and reinforced. The sea helps enforce that rule because it creates distance without total invisibility. These Sentinels are not hidden in an unreachable mountain valley. They are visible enough to be seen, but difficult enough to reach. This is an unusual condition. Too much remoteness can make a community unknown even to nearby states. Too little remoteness can invite conquest. North Sentinel sits in the narrow space between. Outsiders know it exists, but knowledge does not become possession. The island is marked on maps, but maps do not soften the reef. The people are discussed in courts, newspapers, documentaries, and government offices, but discussion does not equal access. At times, the sea has also exposed the island to accidental contact. Wrecked boats and stranded sailors are among the most dangerous forms of encounter, because they collapse distant suddenly. A ship in trouble may drift where no one intended to go. The people aboard may see the island as rescue. The people on shore may see invasion. Neither side needs hatred for violence to become likely. Misunderstanding is built into the situation. A desperate outsider wants land, water, and help. The Sentinels want the outsider gone. No shared language exists to negotiate the gap. In such moments, the ocean's fortress becomes a collision point. Yet the Sentinels are not simply hostile shadows at the edge of the surf. Their relationship with the sea must also include ordinary rhythms invisible to outsiders, morning movement along the shore, children learning shallow water, tools repaired near canoes, fish carried into the forest shade, bodies salt-streaked after work, storms watched from cover, calm days used fully because rough days will come. The outside record remembers arrows because arrows are dramatic. The island remembers tides because tides are life. There is something almost humbling in this reversal. The modern world builds aircraft carriers, container ports, undersea cables, satellite navigation, and global shipping systems. It treats the ocean as a managed space, measured and crossed. But near North Sentinel, the old sea remains sovereign. A powerful state can declare an exclusion zone, but the reef was excluding long before the state existed. A helicopter can hover, but it cannot land safely among people who reject it. A ship can carry steel, fuel, engines, radios, and maps, yet still become useless if the water takes it onto coral. The ocean as fortress is therefore not a romantic image. It is a practical arrangement made from ecology, memory, and choice. The reef slows strangers. The surf exposes them. The beach narrows their options. The forest receives the islanders back into cover. The sea provides food and materials while also limiting invasion. No single explanation fully accounts for Sentinel's survival. But this relationship with water is one of the central reasons their world remains their own. And as the tide moves over the coral, the island continues its old negotiation. It takes from the sea without surrendering to it. It watches what the sea brings and decides what to keep. It lets fish, turtles, shells, wood, and wreck metal enter, but not the ambitions attached to them. The sea is not empty space around North Sentinel. It is memory in motion, a shining wall, a dangerous pantry, and the first language every stranger must face before the island answers. Beyond the reef, the world keeps growing louder. For most of human history, that noise reaches North Sentinel only as rumour made visible a sail at the edge of the sea, a strange hull passing far off, wreckage drifting in after weather, perhaps the unfamiliar smell of smoke from a vessel that does not belong to the island. But by the time European empires begin forcing their way through the Indian Ocean with charts, guns, prisons, ports, and hunger for control, the Andaman Islands can no longer remain only a scattered forested archipelago between larger worlds. They become strategic ground. They become a problem to be surveyed. They become a place outsiders intend to name, classify, and manage. The British Empire, in particular, transforms the wider Andaman story. After earlier attempts and scattered encounters, the British establish a penal colony in the islands in the 19th century, most famously at Port Blair. For the Empire, the islands offer distance, punishment, and a naval foothold. For indigenous Andamanese peoples, that same project brings disruption on a devastating scale. Forests become administrative territory. Old movement patterns are interrupted. Outsiders arrive in numbers, diseases arrive with them. What looks on imperial paper like settlement, security, and order can look on the ground like intrusion, sickness, and loss. The evidence from the wider Andamans is grim enough that North Sentinel's refusal begins to appear less like mystery and more like memory sharpened into policy. Colonial officers often approached indigenous peoples with a mixture of curiosity, fear, contempt, and paternalism. They wanted information, control, labour, peace on their terms, and sometimes conversion or civilizing transformation. The Andamanese were described, measured, photographed, categorized, and frequently misunderstood. Some officials attempted gift-giving and contact missions. Others used force. In many cases, outsiders assumed that resistance came from savagery rather than from a rational reading of danger. This was one of Empire's most convenient misunderstandings. If a people defended their land, they were hostile. If they fled, they were timid. If they accepted gifts, they were becoming dependent. If they died of disease, their disappearance was treated as tragic but somehow inevitable. No single explanation fully accounts for the collapse of several Andamanese populations, but disease, violence, dispossession, and colonial disruption all played central roles. North Sentinel appears in this wider imperial field as an island that resists being turned into knowledge. British records include attempts to survey and approach it, but the island never becomes a normal colonial possession in the live sense. It is claimed on maps, placed inside administrative boundaries, and spoken about in reports. yet the people remain outside ordinary control. This distinction is crucial. Empire can draw a line around a place without entering its social world. A map can absorb an island more easily than a beach can. One of the most disturbing patterns in colonial contact across the Andamans was the use of abduction as a tool of understanding. Officials sometimes captured indigenous people, held them, observed them, gave them gifts, and returned them, imagining that this would create trust or open communication. To modern ears, the cruelty of that logic is obvious. To the people seized, it could only have confirmed the danger of strangers. North Sentinel was not spared such attempts. In the late 19th century, a British expedition led by Maurice Vidal Portman reached the island and took several Sentinelese individuals, including elderly people and children. The adults reportedly became ill and died. The children were returned with gifts. The full Sentinelese interpretation of this event is unknowable, but the outline alone is enough. Strangers came from the sea, entered the island, seized people, and death followed. That episode stands like a dark mark in the island's outside history. It is also a key to understanding later refusal. Outsiders sometimes portray Sentinelese hostility as inexplicable, as if arrows fly from the beach for no reason. But if even a fragment of social memory preserves such events, then hostility needs no exotic explanation. The evidence remains incomplete, and no outsider can say how the Sentinelese remember that encounter, or whether it survives in story at all. Yet communities do not need written archives to remember danger. Memory can live in warnings, in rules for children, in the emotional force attached to the horizon. A single traumatic contact can echo for generations when the community is small and the threat returns in recognizable form. Meanwhile, other Andamanese peoples were being pulled into colonial systems with catastrophic consequences. The Great Andamanese, once composed of multiple distinct groups, suffered dramatic population decline after sustained contact. Diseases such as measles, influenza, and other infections tore through communities with little immunity. Alcohol, dependency, relocation, and violence deepened the damage. The Ongan Jarawa also faced pressures from settlement, roads, poaching, and administrative interference, though their histories differ. These neighbouring stories matter because they show what contact often meant in practice. It did not simply mean exchange, it often meant demographic collapse. The Sentinelese island, protected by reef and refusal, avoided the full machinery of this transformation. Not because empire respected their sovereignty from the beginning, and not because outsiders lacked curiosity, but because the cost of intrusion remained high and the perceived rewards remained low. North Sentinel had no obvious harbour, no plantation promise, no large population to tax or recruit, no strategic settlement site worth a major campaign of occupation. It was troublesome, small, and resistant. In the cold arithmetic of empire, that may have helped save it. There is a lesser-known irony here. Some communities survive not because outsiders consider them important, but because outsiders consider them inconvenient. North Sentinel's people were not protected by admiration. They were protected partly by being difficult to reach, difficult to use, and dangerous to approach. History is full of such accidental shelters, mountains too poor for conquest, deserts too harsh for armies, wetlands too unhealthy for settlement, islands too reef-bound for easy landing. These places are not outside history. They're shaped by the fact that power does not always spend itself where profit is uncertain. Still, the horizon had changed forever. Once imperial mapping begins, North Sentinel is no longer unknown to outside administrations. Its isolation becomes documented. Its people become a subject of reports. The island enters a paper world that its inhabitants do not participate in and may not even know exists. Their names for themselves, for the island, for the reef, for outsiders, remain unknown. The name Sentinel itself is an outsider's label, likely tied to British naming practices in the region. This creates a strange imbalance. The world can speak about them endlessly, but not with them. It can name them without knowing their name. As Empire expands, the meaning of the seawall shifts. The reef is no longer only a local barrier against occasional strangers. It becomes a buffer against a global system. The people on the island are not merely keeping away neighbouring rivals or passing sailors. They are, knowingly or not, holding the line against one of the most aggressive political forces in modern history. And unlike many larger societies with armies, forts, kings, and treaties, they succeed in the most basic sense. They remain. This does not mean nothing changes. Contact, even failed contact, leaves traces. Wrecked materials may enter toolmaking, memories may harden, defensive practices may intensify. Outsiders may introduce not only objects but new categories of threat. A people does not have to be conquered to be affected by attempted conquest. North Sentinel's later posture toward visitors may be partly the product of long experience at the edgeboats come. Danger follows, keep them away. By the time colonial rule gives way to the modern Indian state, the Andaman Islands have already been transformed. Port Blair exists. Settler populations have grown. Roads and institutions spread through parts of the archipelago. Some indigenous groups survive only in reduced numbers. Others negotiate uneasy relationships with administration, tourism, welfare, and intrusion. North Sentinel remains apart, but not in the same world as before. It is now an island inside a state, protected and threatened by the same modern attention. Empires at the horizon do not need to land everywhere to change the meaning of a place. Sometimes their greatest effect is to make refusal necessary. On North Sentinel, every approaching boat carries more than people. It carries the history of surveys, kidnappings, diseases, gifts with hidden costs, and the long habit of outsiders assuming that curiosity grants rights. The Sentinelese response, seen from the beach, may look sudden, a drawn bow, a warning stance, a refusal to let the distance close. Seen against the history of the Andamans, it looks older, heavier, and far more understandable. Contact becomes dangerous long before anyone admits that contact itself may be the problem. For centuries, outsiders tend to imagine encounter as a one-way opening, as if a boat arriving at a beach simply brings knowledge, gifts, rescue, religion, or civilization. But on islands like North Sentinel, the arrival of strangers is never neutral. It changes the balance of risk before a single word is understood. It brings bodies carrying unfamiliar diseases. It brings weapons, demands, confusion, and assumptions. It brings people who often believe their intentions matter more than the consequences. For the Sentinelese, and for many indigenous peoples of the Andamans, the first lesson of contact is not connection, it is danger. The tragedy is that many outsiders failed to recognize this even when the evidence was visible everywhere around them. Across the wider Andaman Islands, communities declined after sustained contact with colonial authorities, settlers, sailors, and administrators. Illness moved faster than understanding. A fever that might be ordinary in one population could become devastating in another. Measles, influenza, respiratory infections. and other diseases were not just medical events. They were historical forces. They broke families, weakened elders, disrupted teaching, reduced births, and made whole ways of life harder to maintain. The evidence remains incomplete in many details, but the broad pattern is not mysterious. Contact repeatedly brought demographic catastrophe. North Sentinel's hostility has often been treated as the central fact about the island. But hostility is only the visible edge of a deeper history. A drawn bow on a beach is easy to film. The reasoning behind it is harder to see. If strangers arrive and people later die, the lesson does not require written theory. If visitors seize children, leave objects, return unpredictably, and ignore warnings, then refusal becomes a practical law. Scholars still debate how much specific historical memory the Sentinelers retain of 19th century abductions or other encounters. But a community does not need to remember every detail to preserve a rule: do not let outsiders in. This is where misunderstanding becomes deadly. Outsiders often approach with categories that make sense only to themselves. A coconut is interpreted as a gift. A gesture is interpreted as friendliness. A lack of immediate attack is interpreted as permission. A warning shot from a bow is interpreted as savagery rather than communication. But without shared language, the margin for error is enormous. One side may think it is beginning peaceful contact. The other may think it is being tested, surrounded, tricked, or invaded. No single explanation fully accounts for every Sentinelese response, because the record consists of brief, tense observations. Yet the overall pattern is clear: the islanders have repeatedly tried to control distance, and outsiders have repeatedly tried to reduce it. In the 20th century, especially after India took over administration of the islands, contact attempts became more organized and, in some cases, less openly violent than colonial raids. Anthropologists and officials approached with gifts, often coconuts, because coconuts do not grow naturally in abundance on North Sentinel in the same way they do on some other islands, and could be offered without forcing immediate dependence. Teams came by boat, left items, watched from the water, and sometimes tried to build familiarity over repeated visits. These expeditions were often framed as cautious, scientific, or humanitarian. Compared with earlier abductions, they were certainly less brutal, but they still carried risks. A well-meaning visitor can bring disease. A friendly gesture can still violate a boundary. A gift can create pressure where none was requested. Some encounters appeared briefly promising. There were moments when Sentinelese individuals approached, took coconuts, or did not immediately attack. These moments fascinated outsiders, who saw in them the possible beginning of a relationship. But they are difficult to interpret. Accepting a floating coconut is not the same as consenting to contact. Standing near a boat is not the same as inviting strangers ashore. Curiosity is not surrender. People everywhere investigate unusual things without wanting their world transformed by them. The Sentinelers may have been curious, strategic, amused, cautious, or divided among themselves. The evidence remains incomplete, and it is safer to admit that outsiders do not know. There is a lesser-known detail in some accounts of contact attempts that reveals how unstable these encounters could be. A meeting might begin calmly and shift suddenly. A person might accept a gift, then another might signal anger. A group might tolerate distance but react strongly when the boat came too close or when gestures were misread. This should not surprise anyone. Even within a single community, people can disagree about danger. Younger people may be curious, elders may be wary. Some may want useful goods, others may fear contamination or trap. Outsiders often looked for a single tribal attitude, but human societies rarely work that simply. The death of outsiders near North Sentinel has intensified the island's reputation, but even those events must be understood within the logic of boundary defence. Fishermen who illegally entered the protected waters in 2006 were killed after their boat drifted too close. In 2018, an American missionary, John Allen Chow, was killed after making repeated illegal attempts to reach the island despite restrictions intended to protect the Sentinelese. These incidents became global news because they seemed to confirm the island's danger, yet they also confirmed something else. The danger often begins when outsiders disregard distance. From the Sentinelese perspective, a stranger repeatedly approaching the shore is not an abstract seeker of meaning. He is an intruder entering a place where intrusion has long been forbidden. The missionary case especially exposed the collision between modern desire and indigenous survival. Some saw Chow as brave or devout, others saw him as reckless, endangering a vulnerable people for his own religious mission. The protective rules existed for a reason. The Sentinelese have no known immunity to many outside diseases, and their lack of contact means even minor exposure could have severe consequences. What makes the event so tragic is that it was unnecessary. The island had already communicated its refusal. The law had already recognized that refusal. Still, the old pattern repeated. An outsider believed his purpose justified crossing the boundary. This is one of the hardest truths in the story. Not all harmful contact comes wearing the face of conquest. Some comes as rescue, some comes as science, some comes as charity, some comes as faith, some comes as adventure. The Sentinelese cannot be expected to distinguish safely among these motives at the water's edge, and history suggests they would be unwise to try. For a small community, the cost of trusting the wrong visitor could be extinction. The cost of refusing all visitors is isolation from some benefits, but also protection from overwhelming harm. That calculation may seem severe, but it is not irrational. The word hostile therefore needs care. It describes an outward behavior but can distort the moral picture. A person defending a home from forced entry is not hostile in the same sense as a person seeking violence for its own sake. The Sentinelese have not sailed outward to attack distant communities. They have not tried to expand territory. Their violence, when it occurs, is tied to approach, landing, and violation of boundary. This does not make every act simple or harmless. And it does not erase the deaths of outsiders, but it places them in context. The island's danger is mainly directed outward at intrusion, not outward as conquest. The modern state eventually learned, imperfectly and slowly, that restraint might be the only ethical policy. This learning came after centuries in which indigenous peoples across the world were studied to death, converted into dependency, displayed as curiosities, relocated for their supposed good, and exposed to diseases in the name of progress. North Sentinel stands as a late lesson in a very old failure. The best way to protect a people may be to leave them alone. Not because they are objects in a museum, but because they are subjects with a clear political message: stay away. And still, curiosity remains powerful. The island draws attention precisely because it denies access. People want to know the language, the stories, the beliefs, the number of families, the origin of their isolation, the details of daily life. That desire is human, but it is also dangerous. The unanswered question can become an excuse. History is full of outsiders who began with curiosity and ended with control. North Sentinel asks whether curiosity can accept a boundary without turning that boundary into a challenge. Contact turns dangerous because the beach is not a meeting room. It is a fault line between unequal worlds. On one side stands a small community with limited immunity, limited numbers, and a long memory of risk. On the other side stands a global civilization with engines, cameras, courts, religions, diseases, and an almost limitless appetite for access. When those worlds collide, the smaller one bears the greater danger. The arrows on the shore are not the mystery's end. They are the island's answer to a question outsiders keep asking after it has already been answered. There are places on the map that exist more in rumour than in knowledge, and North Sentinel has become one of them. Not because it is invisible, but because everything about it resists completion. The island has been photographed, circled, observed from helicopters, and approached by boats over decades. Yet it remains fundamentally unmapped in the ways that matter most. There is no reliable internal geography, no known place names, no confirmed paths, no census, no shared language, no archive. What exists instead is a scattered record of glimpses, moments when the outside world came close enough to see, but not close enough to understand. In the late 20th century, Indian authorities and anthropologists conducted a series of cautious expeditions, attempting controlled contact under increasingly careful guidelines. These missions often involved boats stopping at a distance, leaving coconuts in the water, and slowly testing whether the sentinelers would approach. Some of the most striking footage and descriptions from these encounters come from these efforts. Figures appear at the shoreline. Men with bows stand in the surf. Sometimes they shout or gesture. Sometimes they retrieve coconuts from the water. Occasionally, they come close enough to observe directly, but never in a way that removes the boundary. What makes these moments so strange is how incomplete they are. A camera can capture bodies, tools, movement, but it cannot capture intention. An observer can note that a person smiles, but cannot know whether the expression carries the same meaning as it would in another culture. A raised bow could be warning, anger, ritual, or something else entirely. The evidence remains incomplete, and interpretation is always at risk of projection. Outsiders tend to fill silence with their own assumptions, turning fragments into narratives that feel whole but may be fundamentally wrong. There were periods when officials believed that limited, respectful contact might eventually lead to a stable relationship. The idea was that repeated visits, non-threatening behavior, and gifts could reduce hostility and allow some level of communication. In some ways, this reflected lessons learned from earlier colonial mistakes, but it also carried a hidden assumption that contact itself was desirable, or at least inevitable. Over time, that assumption began to weaken. Encounters never became stable. They fluctuated. In one visit, the sentinelese might approach the water and accept coconuts. In another, they might remain distant or show clear hostility. There were reports of individuals showing curiosity, even humour, and others displaying anger or suspicion. No consistent pattern emerged that could safely guide future contact. The island did not open, it reacted. One lesser-known complication in these expeditions was the presence of different individuals within the Sentinelese community, responding differently to outsiders. Observers sometimes noted that younger individuals appeared more willing to approach, while others kept their distance or displayed warning behaviour. This suggests internal variation, something often ignored in simplified portrayals. The Sentinelers are not a single mind. They are a community of individuals, likely with their own views, experiences and roles. The outsiders, however, could only see the surface of that complexity. Over time, even the limited contact missions began to feel increasingly risky. The potential benefit gaining knowledge, Perhaps establishing communication was weighed against the potential harm. Disease remained the greatest concern. A single infection introduced by visitors could spread quickly through a small, immunologically vulnerable population. Even a well-planned expedition could not eliminate that risk completely. The more the outside world understood about these dangers, the less justifiable contact seemed. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, a shift became clear. Indian authorities moved toward a policy of non-interference. Instead of trying to reach the Sentinelas, the goal became to protect their isolation. Patrols were increased to prevent illegal fishing and unauthorized visits. The island was effectively declared off-limits, not as a challenge to be overcome, but as a boundary to be respected. This was a rare moment in modern history, a state choosing restraint over access, distance over integration. And yet, the island continued to produce moments that reminded the world it was still there. Helicopter surveys after storms or natural disasters occasionally passed over the area. Each time, observers looked for signs of survival. After the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, one such helicopter approached cautiously, uncertain of what it might find. The devastation across the region had been enormous. Entire coastlines were destroyed. Communities vanished. There was real fear that North Sentinel, low-lying and exposed, might have been wiped out. Instead, a figure appeared on the beach. A man emerged from the trees, drew his bow, and fired an arrow toward the aircraft. It was a brief moment, almost symbolic, but it carried immense meaning. It suggested that the islanders had survived one of the most powerful natural disasters in recorded history, and that their response to an approaching machine was unchanged. The boundary held. The message remained the same. This kind of moment reinforces the strange position North Sentinel occupies in the modern world. It is known, but not understood. It is protected, but not governed in the usual sense. It is part of a nation-state, yet outside its cultural and administrative systems, it is observed, but not entered. The island exists in a kind of deliberate incompleteness, where the absence of knowledge is not a failure to be corrected, but a condition to be preserved. There are also practical reasons why the island resists mapping beyond the social boundary. Even if access were permitted, the environment itself would make detailed study difficult. Dense forest limits visibility. The absence of roads or clearings makes movement slow. The climate affects equipment. The reef restricts landing. But these physical challenges are secondary to the ethical ones. The real barrier is not the forest or the sea. It is the recognition that entering the island without consent would repeat a long history of harm. Scholars still debate what might be learned if communication were possible. Language, kinship systems, ecological knowledge, oral history. These are all areas of deep interest. But the debate has shifted. Increasingly, the question is not what can be learned, but whether learning justifies the risk. North Sentinel forces a confrontation with the limits of research. It asks whether some human knowledge must remain incomplete by choice, not by accident. The island's refusal also creates a mirror. It reflects the habits of the outside world back onto itself. Why is access assumed to be a right? Why is curiosity treated as harmless? Why is isolation seen as a problem to be solved? These questions do not have simple answers, but North Sentinel makes them unavoidable. It is a place where the usual logic of exploration fails, not because the island is unreachable, but because it has been made unreachable by decision. In a world where almost every place has been entered, measured, and recorded, North Sentinel remains one of the last spaces where presence does not equal knowledge. A satellite image can show the outline of the island, but not its meaning. A boat can approach the reef, but not cross the social boundary. A camera can capture movement on the beach, but not translate it into understanding. The island refuses maps not by hiding, but by standing in plain sight and saying no. And in that refusal, it preserves something increasingly rare, a human story that unfolds without being written by outsiders. A culture that exists without explanation. A place where the edge of the world is not a metaphor, but a line drawn in sand and defended by memory. Then the sea rose. On the morning of December 26, 2004, far beneath the Indian Ocean, one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded tore open the boundary between tectonic plates. The seabed shifted with unimaginable force. Water lifted, energy spread outward through the ocean at the speed of a jet aircraft, almost invisible in deep water, gathering itself into disaster as it approached land, across the Indian Ocean. Coastlines that had known the sea all their lives suddenly faced it in a form beyond ordinary memory. Waves struck Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, Thailand, the Maldives, and far beyond. Villages were erased, boats were thrown inland, families vanished in minutes. The modern world, with all its instruments and warnings and governments, watched helplessly as the disaster became one of the deadliest natural events in recent history. North Sentinel lay in the path of that transformed ocean. For anyone looking at a map, the fear was immediate. The island is low, reef-ringed and exposed. It does not rise like a mountain fortress. It has beaches and coastal forest, the very zones where tsunamis can do their worst work. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands were close to the earthquake zone, and many parts of the archipelago were violently affected. Land shifted, reefs changed, shores altered. Some areas rose, others subsided. The familiar line between sea and land was redrawn in hours by forces that had been building for centuries. If a small isolated population lived close to the shore, with no outside warning system and no possibility of evacuation by road or aircraft, it was reasonable to fear the worst. But disaster is never experienced only through instruments. Long before seismographs and satellite alerts, coastal peoples around the world learned to read signs. The sudden withdrawal of the sea, the strange behavior of animals, a deep tremor, a sound unlike ordinary surf, the memory of old stories telling people to move inland when the ocean behaves incorrectly. It is not known exactly what the Sentinelese saw, felt, or did that morning. The evidence remains incomplete, and no one can ask them. But their survival suggests that they were not simply passive victims waiting on the beach. They may have moved quickly into higher or safer parts of the forest. They may have recognized danger from the earthquake itself or from changes in the water. They may have possessed inherited knowledge of great waves, preserved not as scientific explanation but as practical warning. Scholars still debate the details, because the island gives no testimony. The first outside concern came from the air. After the tsunami, Indian authorities conducted surveys of remote islands to assess damage and search for survivors. When a helicopter approached North Sentinel, it did not find silence, it found resistance. A Sentinelese man appeared on the beach and aimed an arrow toward the aircraft. The image became famous because it was so stark after a catastrophe that had killed vast numbers across the region. Here was a person from one of the world's most isolated communities not only alive, but strong enough to warn away the machine overhead. The gesture was brief, but it carried the weight of an entire history. The island had survived. The boundary had survived. Even after the Great Wave, the answer to outsiders remained the same. That moment has often been romanticized, but it deserves a more careful reading. The arrow did not prove that the Sentinelas were untouched by the tsunami. It did not reveal how many people had died, whether homes were destroyed, whether food sources were damaged, or whether the reef had changed in ways that made life harder afterward. It proved only that at least some people survived and retained their ability to defend the island. The rest remains uncertain. A small community can survive a disaster and still suffer losses invisible from the air. The fact that they remained independent does not mean the event left no scars. The Andaman region itself was physically altered. In some places, land uplift exposed coral reefs that had been underwater. In others, subsidence allowed the sea to intrude into forests and settlements. Such changes matter deeply to island peoples. A reef that rises or dies can affect fishing. A freshwater source contaminated by salt can reshape daily life. A beach altered by erosion can change turtle nesting or landing places. Forest damaged by salt water may recover slowly or differently. What survives in the record suggests that the 2004 earthquake changed parts of the island's coastal geography, though the specific effects on North Sentinel are not fully known. For the Sentinelese, the disaster may have demanded adjustment long after the headlines faded. This is one of the surprising lessons of deep time survival. A people can live in a place that seems impossible, not because disaster never comes, but because their culture contains ways to respond when it does. The modern imagination often separates catastrophe from ordinary life. Disaster is an interruption, a sudden break in normal time. But for communities living in cyclone belts, earthquake zones, volcanic islands, floodplains, or drought lands, danger is part of the long pattern. It is remembered, planned around, folded into settlement choices, food habits, mobility, and warning signs. North Sentinel's people may not have scientific terms for subduction zones or tsunami propagation, but scientific vocabulary is not the only form of survival knowledge. There is a lesser-known comparison from elsewhere in the Andaman and Nicobar region. Some indigenous communities reportedly survived the tsunami by moving away from the shore after noticing natural warning signs, while many outsiders or settled populations suffered terribly. This does not mean indigenous knowledge is magical or infallible. It means close attention to environment can save lives in conditions where formal warning systems fail or do not exist. The Sentinelist survival fits within that broader possibility, though it cannot be proven in detail. No single explanation fully accounts for what happened on the island that day. Instinct, memory, observation, luck, topography, and timing may all have played roles. The tsunami also revealed something uncomfortable about outside concern. When the helicopter approached, it came in the name of rescue and assessment. Yet even rescue can be intrusive when people have not asked for it, and when contact itself carries danger. The authorities faced a difficult balance. They needed to know whether the population had survived, but landing could expose survivors to disease or conflict. The arrow resolved the question with brutal clarity. The islanders were alive, and they did not want assistance delivered by strangers. In that moment, respecting their refusal was not abandonment, it was protection. For the global public, the story became almost mythic, the tribe that survived the tsunami and shot arrows at a helicopter. But the myth can flatten the reality. It can turn people into symbols of defiance while ignoring the human vulnerability beneath. The Sentinelas were not characters in a legend. They were survivors of a regional catastrophe, facing whatever damage the wave had done to their home. They may have lost tools, shelters, food stores, or people. They may have had to relearn altered shorelines, They may have dealt with grief beyond outside knowledge. The fact that they did not accept help does not mean they did not need strength. The tsunami placed North Sentinel into a much older frame. The island exists in a restless geological zone. Earthquakes and sea level changes have shaped the Andaman world for millennia. The reef that protects the island is also evidence of long environmental change. Coastlines move. Coral grows, breaks, dies, and returns. Forest advances and retreats. The people living there are not surviving in a stable Eden, but in a shifting landscape. Their isolation is therefore not only political or cultural, it is ecological endurance across instability. That endurance challenges a common assumption. Outsiders often imagine small-scale societies as fragile because they lack modern infrastructure. But infrastructure can be fragile too. Roads wash away. Electrical grids fail. Ports collapse. Communication towers fall. A society with deep local knowledge, flexible shelter, diversified food sources, and strong environmental awareness may survive certain disasters better than a more complex system dependent on distant supply chains. This does not make one way of life superior in every sense. It simply reminds us that resilience is not always where modern people expect to find it. After the Great Wave, North Sentinel did not open. It did not become a humanitarian project. It did not become a field station for disaster researchers. It returned, at least from the outside view, to distance. The forest closed again behind the beach. The reef continued to break the sea into white lines. The people remained beyond speech. The world, briefly alarmed, moved on to other disasters, other headlines, other mysteries. But something had been revealed. The island was not merely hiding from history. It had passed through history's violence in one of its most elemental forms: earth movement, ocean surge, coastal transformation. And still, someone stood on the sand with a bow raised toward the sky, facing not an empire this time, not a missionary, not a survey boat, but a flying machine sent after one of the greatest waves in living memory. It was a small human figure against a vast disaster. It was also one of the clearest statements North Sentinel has ever given the outside world: we're still here. The outside world has never been satisfied with not knowing. Around North Sentinel, that dissatisfaction has produced a thick fog of myths, half-truths, dramatic headlines, and careless phrases repeated until they begin to feel like facts. The island is called untouched, primitive, hostile, Stone Age, lost, timeless, dangerous, pure, savage, innocent, doomed, or miraculous, depending on what story the outsider wants to tell. Each label says something, but usually not enough. Some say almost nothing about the Sentinels at all. They reveal instead the old habit of turning distant people into symbols. The most common misunderstanding is that the Sentinels are living exactly as humans lived tens of thousands of years ago. It is a tempting image because it seems to offer a window into prehistory, as if one could look across the reef and see the deep past still walking under the trees. But this is not how human history works. The Sentinelese are not preserved ancestors. They are contemporary people. Their tools, customs, memories, and decisions have developed through their own history. Even if outsiders cannot record that history in detail, they may use materials scavenged from modern wrecks. They may have changed settlement patterns after storms. They may have altered defensive behavior after encounters with outsiders. The evidence remains incomplete, but incompleteness is not permission to imagine stillness. A society without writing is not a society without time. Another misunderstanding is that isolation means total ignorance of the outside world. North Sentinel is isolated in the sense that sustained contact has not been established, and the Sentinelists remain outside normal political, economic, and social exchange. But they almost certainly know that outsiders exist. Boats have approached, helicopters have flown overhead, shipwrecks have happened near the reef, objects from beyond the island have washed ashore. They may not know the scale of the world outside the cities, continents, religions, machines, wars, markets, and languages surrounding them, but they know enough to recognize intrusion. Their refusal is not the innocence of people unaware of alternatives. It appears to be the decision of people who understand, in their own terms, that strangers are dangerous. The word hostile also misleads when it stands alone. The Sentinels have used violence, and outsiders have died near the island. That cannot be softened into romance, but hostility without context becomes a moral shortcut. The Sentinelist response is overwhelmingly defensive and territorial. They do not leave the island to attack others. They do not raid distant settlements. They respond when people come too close, land, hover, or ignore warnings. To describe them simply as aggressive is to erase the beach, the history, the disease risk, the abductions, the illegal approaches, and the repeated failure of outsiders to accept refusal. No single explanation fully accounts for every encounter, but the pattern is not random bloodlust. It is border enforcement by a small community with very good reasons to fear contact. There is also the myth of purity, which seems kinder but can be just as distorting. Some outsiders imagine the Sentinelists as untouched representatives of a natural human state, living in harmony beyond the corruptions of modern civilization. This reverses the old insult without escaping the old frame. It still turns them into an idea rather than a people. They are not pure symbols. They are human beings with conflict, illness, fear, skill, humour, loss, and practical problems. Their world may contain ecological knowledge of astonishing depth, but it is not a paradise outside suffering. Children may die, storms may destroy shelters, hunger may come, injuries may become fatal, social tensions may exist. The refusal of modernity does not remove hardship. It only means their hardships and strengths remain mostly unknown to us. Some popular theories go even further, suggesting that the Sentinelists are survivors of Atlantis-like lost civilizations, descendants of shipwrecked outsiders, or evidence of secret ancient migrations beyond mainstream scholarship. These claims usually collapse under scrutiny. There is no need for unsupported mysteries when the real one is already profound. The Andamanese peoples fit within the broader human story of ancient settlement, island adaptation, and long-term cultural continuity. That story is extraordinary enough without adding fantasy. Scholars still debate details of ancestry and timing, but the responsible debate is grounded in anthropology, archaeology, linguistics, genetics, ecology, and the limits of evidence, not in invented civilizations. A subtler misunderstanding comes from assuming that because the Sentinelese reject contact, they reject change. Human beings constantly change, even when they defend boundaries. A new storm changes a coastline. A new wreck changes available metal. A new generation changes decisions. A disease outbreak, a food shortage, a leadership shift, a marriage pattern, a conflict, or a successful season can alter a community's path. The Sentinelists may be conservative about contact while adaptive in daily life. In fact, that combination may be one reason they endure. They hold the border firmly while adjusting within it. The outside world also often misunderstands scale. North Sentinel is small, and its population is probably small, though estimates vary widely. Smallness is sometimes confused with simplicity, but small societies can have intricate systems of kinship, obligation, memory, territory, taboo, teaching, and ecological classification. A language spoken by a few dozen or a few hundred people can contain fine distinctions unknown to global languages. A path through forest can hold more practical information than a printed map. A rule about when not to fish a certain place may encode generations of observation. What survives in the record suggests only fragments of Sentinelli's life, but those fragments should make outsiders cautious, not condescending. Perhaps the deepest misunderstanding is the belief that every human society naturally wants to be connected to the global system once it sees what that system offers. This belief is one of modernity's quiet religions. It assumes that roads, hospitals, markets, schools, phones, and state citizenship are self-evidently desirable, and in many contexts they can bring real benefits. But benefits never arrive alone. They come with dependency, exposure, surveillance, law, labor demands, cultural pressure, disease, land loss, and the erosion of local autonomy. For a small island community with no immunity to many outside illnesses and no shared language with administrators, the cost of connection could be existential. The Sentinelese are not irrational for refusing an offer whose terms they did not set. This does not mean their isolation should be romanticized as perfect freedom. They are also vulnerable because they are few, because their island is limited, and because their fate can be affected by decisions made far away. A passing fishing boat, a political change, a reckless adventurer, or an introduced pathogen could transform their future. Their independence depends partly on outsiders continuing to restrain themselves. That is a fragile kind of sovereignty. It is real, but it is surrounded. The law now recognizes this more than older systems did. Protective restrictions around North Sentinel are not simply about preventing violence against visitors. They are about preventing visitors from becoming a threat to the islanders. That reversal is important. For years. The question was how to make the Sentinelese safe for outsiders to approach. The better question is how to make outsiders safe enough to keep away. The answer, so far, is distance, patrol, and a rare official willingness to let a human community remain unentered. In the end, what outsiders misunderstand most is the meaning of the unknown itself. The unknown is not always an empty space waiting to be filled. Sometimes it's a boundary created by another people's will. The silence around Sentinel's language, belief, and memory is not merely a gap in academic knowledge, it is part of their survival. To respect that silence is difficult because it frustrates curiosity. But difficulty is not an excuse to violate it. North Sentinel is not a time capsule, not a monster's island, not a paradise, not a museum, and not a puzzle placed on Earth for outsiders to solve. It is a homeland. The people there are neither ancient ghosts nor symbols of innocence. They are a living community navigating a dangerous relationship with a world far larger than their island. A world that has repeatedly mistaken access for understanding. The more carefully one looks at the myths, the more they fall away. What remains is less sensational and more powerful, a people who have survived by knowing the difference between what to take from the sea and what to keep beyond the reef. The most important law around North Sentinel may be the one that tells the world not to move. This is unusual. Modern states usually express power by entering, counting, naming, building, policing, registering, educating, treating, taxing, and absorbing. Governments like roads because roads make people reachable. They like censuses because numbers make people legible. They like schools, clinics, documents, borders, and offices because these things turn lives into categories that can be administered. Around North Sentinel, however, the most protective form of state power is restraint. The island is guarded not by bringing the sentinels into the system, but by keeping most of the system away. This did not happen instantly. It emerged from a long history of failure. Earlier contact attempts across the Andamans had shown, again and again, that outsiders could destroy even when they believed they were helping. Disease did not care about good intentions. Dependency did not announce itself as harm at first. A gift could become leverage. A visit could become a precedent. A survey could become intrusion. The evidence remains incomplete in many details. But the broader lesson became harder to deny. Some communities are safest when their refusal is treated as final. India's policy toward North Sentinel has therefore moved toward non-contact and exclusion. The island and its surrounding waters are protected, and unauthorized approach is prohibited. The purpose is not only to protect visitors from arrows, though that is the detail that often captures public attention. The deeper purpose is to protect the sentinels from visitors. A tourist, a fisherman, a missionary, or an adventurer can carry more danger in their lungs than in their hands. A cough can be more destructive than a weapon. For a small population with limited exposure to global pathogens, contact can become catastrophe before anyone understands what has happened. This is why distance has become an ethical tool. It may seem cold to leave a community alone when the outside world has medicine, technology, and emergency aid. But aid requires contact, and contact may create the very emergency it claims to solve. No single explanation fully accounts for every possible scenario. There may be cases, after a cyclone or tsunami, when authorities must assess survival from a distance. There may be debates about what to do if a visible disaster threatens the entire population. But the general principle is clear. Intervention is not automatically kindness. Sometimes the first duty is not to help in the way outsiders prefer, but to avoid causing harm. The law of distance also recognizes consent, though in an unusual form. The sentinelers cannot sign treaties with the state, attend court hearings, or issue written declarations. Their language is not understood by officials, yet their position has been expressed repeatedly through action. They do not want outsiders landing. They do not welcome sustained approach. They enforce the shoreline. In most contexts, a refusal this consistent would be understood plainly. North Sentinel tests whether the world can respect a refusal even when it is delivered by arrows instead of paperwork. There is a lesser-known moral difficulty here. Non-contact policy protects the sentinelers, but it also freezes outsiders into uncertainty. Officials do not know exactly how many people they are protecting. They do not know their health conditions, internal conflicts, food security, or needs. They cannot ask whether every person on the island agrees with isolation. They cannot know whether some individuals might want contact while others forbid it. Scholars still debate these questions because the ethical method for answering them does not exist. Any attempt to find out could violate the boundary and create danger. So policy must operate in uncertainty, which is uncomfortable but necessary. This uncertainty has critics. Some argue that the sentinelers are being denied modern medicine, education, and the choice to join the wider world. Others argue that isolation is the only thing standing between them and destruction. Both positions contain concerns worth taking seriously, but they do not carry equal historical weight. The promise of beneficial contact has been made many times to indigenous peoples. Too often, it has led to land loss, cultural breakdown, dependency, illness, and demographic collapse. The burden of proof now lies with those who want to approach. not with those who want to keep the boundary intact. The question of choice is especially complex. A society can only choose contact freely if it understands the consequences and can negotiate terms without coercion. For the Sentinelese, that condition does not exist. The outside world is too large, too infectious, too technologically overwhelming, and too historically aggressive. A single meeting cannot create informed consent between such unequal worlds. Even gifts can distort the situation. Even medical care can create dependency. Even a friendly relationship with officials can open the door to tourists, journalists, traders, missionaries, and political pressure. The first crack in the boundary may not remain small. This is why the protective zone around the island matters. It turns restraint into practice. Patrols discourage illegal fishing and unauthorized approach. Restrictions give authorities the legal basis to stop those who treat the island as a challenge. After the deaths of outsiders who ignored the rules, the importance of enforcement became painfully clear. The law is not symbolic. It is a buffer between curiosity and catastrophe. But enforcement is difficult. The sea is wide, and illegal fishing can be tempting. Fishermen may enter restricted waters for valuable catch. Adventurers may believe the rules are excessive. Missionaries may believe spiritual duty overrides law. Journalists may want images. Tour operators may be drawn by danger. The island's fame creates the very pressure that threatens it. What began as a protective mystery can become a magnet for intrusion. The more the world talks about North Sentinel, the more important the law of distance becomes. There is also a political humility in non-contact that should not be overlooked. States are not naturally humble. They rarely admit that they should not know something. Yet in this case, the best policy requires accepting that the Sentinelus remain socially and culturally outside state knowledge. They are citizens or protected inhabitants in a technical administrative sense, but they are not governed through ordinary intimacy. They are not taxed, schooled, conscripted, or medically surveyed. Their lives remain illegible. For a modern bureaucracy, this is almost a contradiction. For the island, it is survival. The law of distance does not erase responsibility. It creates a different kind of responsibility. Authorities must prevent intrusion, monitor from afar when absolutely necessary, protect surrounding waters, and resist public pressure for access. They must also avoid turning the Sentinelus into a spectacle. Protection can become another form of possession if it is performed mainly for outsiders to admire. The goal is not to display restraint as moral theatre. The goal is to make restraint durable. This approach has implications far beyond North Sentinel. Around the world, isolated and recently contacted indigenous peoples face similar dangers, especially in forested regions of South America and parts of New Guinea. Roads, logging, mining, ranching, missionary work, tourism, and disease can destroy small communities quickly. North Sentinel is unusual because the sea gives a clear boundary and the state has, at least in principle, chosen to defend it. Many other communities are not so fortunate. Their borders are forests, rivers, or territories desired for extraction. They cannot rely on a coral wall to keep bulldozers away. North Sentinel therefore becomes a test case. Can the modern world recognize that survival may require non-entry? Can law protect a people without demanding that they become visible in the ways law usually prefers? Can curiosity remain unsatisfied without turning into resentment? The evidence remains incomplete, and the future is uncertain. But the policy of distance is one of the clearest acknowledgments that past contact was often disastrous. The irony is that the Sentinelese have forced the outside world into a form of civilization it does not always practice self-control. Their island says no, and the law, at its best, says that no must be respected, not because the Sentinelese are strange, not because they are relics, not because they exist for the world's imagination, but because they are people with a homeland, and their continued life may depend on the space between their beach and everyone else's desire. To speak of the Sentinelas as a people is easy. To speak of them in numbers is almost impossible. Outsiders want a population figure because numbers feel solid. They seem to turn mystery into fact. A community of 20 means one kind of vulnerability. A community of 200 means another. Governments, journalists, and scholars have all tried to estimate, often from brief observations, distant photographs, or rough calculations based on island size and visible individuals. The result is not certainty, but a range of guesses. The Sentinelese remain, in one of the most literal senses, a people without numbers. This uncertainty is not a minor technical gap. Population size shapes everything. A very small group faces severe risks from disease, injury, infertility, conflict, and chance. If too few children are born over a generation, the future narrows. If too many people die in a storm or epidemic, knowledge can disappear with them. If the population is larger than outsiders assume, then the island may support a more complex social life than the brief beach encounters reveal. Scholars still debate the estimates because the evidence remains incomplete, and because the only way to count accurately would be to violate the boundary that keeps the people safe. Even basic observations can mislead. A helicopter glimpse may show a handful of people on a beach, but others may be in the forest, at another shore, ill, elderly, children kept hidden, or simply out of sight. A contact party might meet mostly adult men because they are the ones who approach strangers, while women, children, and older people remain inland. A photograph taken after a storm might show fewer people, not because the population is tiny, but because the community has chosen caution. The visible edge of a society is not the society itself. Language is equally hidden. The Sentinelas speak a language unknown to outsiders, and attempts to connect it with other Andamanese languages have not produced reliable understanding. This is one of the strongest reminders that North Sentinel is not merely an isolated camp of a known neighbouring group. It is its own world of meaning. A language carries categories of place, kinship, animals, weather, danger, memory, and emotion. It contains jokes, warnings, names for winds, names for reef conditions, names for relatives, perhaps names for kinds of outsiders. None of this is available to the world beyond the island. The silence is not empty, it is full, but closed. Kinship is another unseen structure. Every small society must organize marriage, descent, childcare, responsibility, and belonging. The Sentinelas must have rules, whether flexible or strict, for who marries whom, who cares for children, who shares food, who resolves conflict, and who has authority in moments of danger. Outsiders do not know whether leadership is formal or situational, whether elders hold special influence, whether certain families are linked parts of the island, or how disputes are settled. No single explanation fully accounts for their long survival without assuming some durable social order. A small population cannot endure on ecology alone. It must also endure socially. Health remains one of the most urgent unknowns. The Sentinelas may be protected from many outside infections by isolation, but they are not protected from all suffering. Cuts can become infected, childbirth can be dangerous, parasites, fevers, malnutrition, dental problems, injuries from hunting or reef work, and complications from aging may all exist. They likely have plant knowledge and care practices suited to their environment, but outsiders cannot know their effectiveness in detail. What survives in the record suggests physical vitality among those seen on beaches, but such glimpses reveal little about the vulnerable, the sick, or the old. There is a lesser-known danger in small populations' knowledge bottlenecks. If only a few people know how to make a certain tool, find a certain medicine, remember a rare disaster sign, or conduct a ritual, the loss of those people can weaken the entire group. Large societies preserve knowledge in books, institutions, and specialists. Small oral societies preserve it through repetition, apprenticeship, and shared memory. This can be remarkably resilient, but it depends on continuity between generations. The survival of children on North Sentinel is therefore not just biological, it is cultural. Every child who learns the island helps keep the island known. Yet outsiders must be careful not to turn vulnerability into pity. The Sentinelese are vulnerable to certain forces, especially disease and intrusion, but they are not helpless. Their continued existence is evidence of competence. A population does not remain on a small island through centuries of storms, colonial expansion, illegal approaches, and environmental change by accident alone. They have defended themselves, adapted to materials, managed food sources, and maintained a social boundary with extraordinary consistency. The evidence remains incomplete, but the result is visible. They are still there. The uncertainty around numbers also affects how the outside world imagines their future. If there are only a few dozen Sentinelese, every unauthorized approach becomes even more dangerous. If there are more, the danger remains severe, but the demographic picture changes. Without accurate knowledge, policy must assume risk. That is frustrating for administrators and researchers, but caution is the only ethical position. Counting them cannot become more important than protecting them. There is something deeply modern about the desire to count. States count people to allocate resources, draw districts, plan schools, measure development, and assert sovereignty. Science counts to compare, model, and explain. Media counts to dramatize. But North Sentinel exposes the limits of enumeration. A people can matter without being counted. A society can have rights without being surveyed. A future can deserve protection even when its population curve cannot be graphed. This does not mean numbers are irrelevant. If the population were known to be collapsing, the ethical dilemma would become agonizing. Would outsiders intervene and risk killing through contact, or remain distant and risk watching a people vanish without help? There is no easy answer. Fortunately, from the limited evidence available, the Sentinelese have continued to show signs of life across decades, including after the 2004 tsunami, but limited evidence is not certainty. Their future remains fragile because so much depends on events that outsiders may not see until too late. Their invisibility is both shield and risk. It protects them from tourism, exploitation, and intrusive study. It also means their suffering, if it occurs, may remain unseen. This is the paradox of non-contact. Respecting autonomy requires accepting distance. Accepting distance means accepting ignorance. Accepting ignorance means living without the comfort of knowing that all is well. The law of distance is necessary, but it is not emotionally simple. Still, the alternative is worse. History shows what often happens when small indigenous communities become fully visible to outsiders. Visibility brings roads, traders, missionaries, officials, photographers, researchers, and the slow conversion of people into subjects of other people's plans. North Sentinel's lack of numbers is part of its defense. The island refuses the first step of administration, the list. So the Sentinelese remain known only by signs. Smoke above trees, figures on a beach, canoes in shallow water, arrows aimed toward aircraft, children glimpsed from a distance, a community inferred from movement and continuity. This is not enough for curiosity, but it may be enough for respect. The island does not owe the world a census to prove its humanity. In the end, the absence of numbers brings the story back to humility. The Sentineless are not a statistic waiting to be completed. They are a living people whose exact size, language, kinship, and inner life remain beyond outside reach. Their mystery is not a puzzle with missing data points. It is a boundary around human dignity, and somewhere inside that boundary, beyond the reef and beyond the forest edge, life continues in ways the world cannot count. Survival on North Sentinel is often described as a mystery of isolation. But isolation alone does not keep anyone alive. A locked door can preserve a room, but it cannot feed the people inside it. The deeper mystery is knowledge, the kind that does not announce itself as science, does not require writing, and does not look impressive to outsiders until the moment it saves a life. The Sentinelese endure not merely because they keep the world away, but because they understand the place that remains. Their survival is not emptiness guarded by arrows. It is a dense, practical intelligence shaped by reef, forest, weather, memory, and generations of correction. A modern visitor might step onto the beach and see only green confusion. The trees would look similar, the sounds difficult to separate, the heat oppressive, the insect life relentless, the tide unpredictable. But for someone raised there, the island is not confusion, it is patterned. One patch of forest may suggest edible roots, another may hold good wood for bows. A certain stretch of shore may be useful after a storm because debris gathers there. A reef pool may be safe at 1 hour and dangerous the next. A bird call may hint at fruiting trees, a crab movement, a change in weather, or nothing at all unless understood within the season. What survives in the record suggests only fragments of this knowledge, but the existence of the community proves that such knowledge must be extensive. This is the kind of intelligence the outside world has often failed to value. Written civilizations leave archives, monuments, inscriptions, and ruins, so their achievements are easier to recognize from a distance. Foraging societies leave subtler traces. Their maps are walked, not drawn. Their calendars are seasonal behaviors, not pages. Their lessons are carried in practice, not stored in libraries. Yet the intellectual demand can be immense. To live from a small island without exhausting it requires memory of limits. It requires knowing when not to take, when to move, when to wait, and when danger is not worth the reward. The Sentinelese likely depend on a wide spread of resources rather than a single food source. That diversity is a form of insurance. Fish, shellfish, crabs, forest animals, wild plants, honey, turtle eggs, and other foods would each rise and fall in importance with season and circumstance. If storms damage one area, another may matter more. If a hunt fails, reef gathering may help. If the sea is rough, the forest may carry the day. No single explanation fully accounts for their endurance. But flexibility almost certainly plays a role. A society tied too tightly to one resource becomes vulnerable when that resource fails. A society that reads many signs has more ways to survive uncertainty. There is also memory of disaster. The 2004 tsunami showed the world a sudden glimpse of Sentinelis resilience, but that resilience may not have been sudden at all. It may have been the visible surface of older knowledge about strange seas and dangerous ground. Coastal peoples in many regions preserve warnings about floods, storms, earthquakes, and waves through stories, taboos, and habits of movement. Scholars still debate exactly what the Sentinelis knew or did when the tsunami came. But the broader principle is clear: environmental memory can outlast written records when it is tied to survival. A rule passed down as story may be as important as a scientific alert if it tells people when to run. Their defense against outsiders is also knowledge. It is easy to focus on the arrow, harder to see the social intelligence behind it. The Sentinelis must decide how close is too close, how many people should appear at the beach, when to warn, when to attack, when to retrieve objects, and when to withdraw. These are not random reactions. They're judgments under pressure: a boat drifting helplessly, a helicopter overhead, a fisherman asleep near the reef, a missionary returning after warnings. Each presents a different kind of threat. The island's responses are shaped by experience, and experience becomes policy when repeated across generations. A lesser-known form of adaptation is the selective use of foreign material without foreign control. Salvaged metal from wrecks is not simply a curiosity. It shows that the Sentinelis are not locked into a fixed technology by ignorance or taboo. They can recognize usefulness, experiment, and incorporate new material into existing systems. But they do so without accepting the people, institutions, or dependencies attached to that material. This is a sophisticated boundary. It separates object from relationship. It says, in effect, the sea may give us iron, but the makers of iron may not enter. The same pattern may apply to other forms of drift and observation. Plastic containers, rope, glass, cloth, or other debris might be useful in ways outsiders never see. A society does not need global trade to be affected by global waste. The ocean now carries traces of distant industry to even the most isolated shores. North Sentinel may reject contact, but it cannot fully reject the planetary systems that send objects across water. This is one of the quiet modern pressures on the island. Even distance is no longer completely clean. The outside world arrives in fragments, and the Sentinelis must decide what can be used and what should be ignored. Survival as knowledge also means knowing people. In a small community, social awareness is not optional. Who is skilled at fishing? Who can make tools? Who tends children well? Who remembers old events? Who becomes reckless? Who carries grief? Who can be trusted in danger? All of this matters. The outside world knows almost nothing about Sentinelis emotional life, but no enduring society exists without it. There must be affection, conflict, teaching, teasing, mourning, cooperation, and discipline. The record is silent, but the silence should not make them flat. The people behind the beach are as socially complex as any people, even if their institutions are invisible to outsiders. Their language, unknown beyond the island, is likely one of the central vessels of this knowledge. Words for reef conditions, plant stages, kinship roles, tools, winds, injuries, and boundaries may encode distinctions outsiders would not notice. When a language disappears, such distinctions can disappear with it. This is why the Sentinelis future matters not only as a matter of population survival, but as a matter of human diversity. Inside that language may be ways of seeing North Sentinel that exist nowhere else on Earth. The evidence remains incomplete because it must remain incomplete. But the possibility alone commands respect. Modern civilization often mistakes scale for wisdom. It sees skyscrapers, satellites, hospitals, universities, and data centers, and assumes knowledge grows only through expansion. But knowledge can also grow through intimacy. A person may know one island more deeply than a state knows an archipelago. A community may understand a reef in ways no survey can capture. This does not make traditional knowledge infallible, and it does not mean the Sentinelists possess supernatural harmony with nature. They are human. They can make mistakes. They can overhunt, misjudge, suffer, argue, and lose. But their continued survival suggests that their knowledge has worked well enough, often enough, across time. This is the central reversal of the island's story. Outsiders say the Sentinelese survive where no human should live. But perhaps the island shows that humans can live in many places if knowledge is fitted closely enough to landscape. The impossibility lies not in the place itself, but in the outsider's ignorance of how to belong there. A modern person dropped onto North Sentinel would be helpless, not because the island is unlivable, but because livability is learned. The Sentinelists have learned it over generations. Their survival is therefore not a miracle in the supernatural sense. It is an accumulation. 1,000 correct choices repeated until they become ordinary. 1,000 warnings remembered. 1,000 meals found in places strangers would miss. 1,000 children taught where the reef cuts, where the forest gives, when the sea lies, and why the horizon must be watched. That kind of knowledge leaves no monument, but it leaves something more important descendants. So when the island appears quiet from above, it should not be mistaken for simplicity. Beneath the canopy is a living archive, carried in bodies and habits, vulnerable precisely because it cannot be backed up elsewhere. If the Sentinelese vanish, the world will not merely lose a population, it will lose an entire way of knowing one small island at the edge of the sea. And that may be the most fragile treasure North Sentinel holds, not secrecy for its own sake, but knowledge that survives only as long as the people who live it. The danger to North Sentinel is no longer only the boat that comes too close. It is also the world that changes the sea, warms the air, empties nearby waters, spreads images faster than warnings, and turns forbidden places into objects of fascination. For centuries, the island's greatest defense was distance. Distance still matters. The reef still breaks the waves, the forest still hides the interior, and the Sentinelists still make the shoreline dangerous to strangers. But distance is weaker than it once was. The modern world has learned to touch places without landing on them. Illegal fishing is one of the clearest threats because it narrows the protective space between the Sentinelers and outsiders. Fishermen may enter restricted waters for practical reasons rather than dramatic ones. Fish move. Livelihoods are difficult. Patrols cannot be everywhere. And a forbidden reef can look like opportunity. But from the island's perspective, the motive does not matter much. A boat near the shore is a possible invasion, a possible infection, a possible conflict. The 2006 killing of 2 fishermen showed how quickly this can become fatal. It was not only a tragedy for the men who died, it was also a warning about how thin the boundary can become when poverty, opportunity, and weak enforcement meet a community that has survived by refusing approach. Disease remains the most frightening threat because it does not look dramatic at first. It does not need a landing party with weapons. It does not need a colonial officer or a missionary determined to stay. It may need only one person close enough, one contaminated object handled carelessly, one encounter that seems harmless until fever appears days later. The Sentinelese have been protected by limited contact, but protection is not immunity. Scholars still debate the exact medical vulnerability of isolated populations in different contexts. Yet the broad danger is well established from history. Respiratory illness, measles-like outbreaks, influenza, and other infections have devastated indigenous communities after contact elsewhere. For a small island population, even a moderate outbreak could cut through generations of knowledge in a few weeks. The fragility is not only biological, it is cultural. If a storm destroys shelters, they can rebuild. If a tool breaks, another can be made. But if too many elders die, too many skilled makers are lost, too many parents are weakened, the damage becomes deeper than numbers. Knowledge has carriers, a language has speakers, a boundary has defenders. A child learns the island from people who already know it. No single explanation fully accounts for how a small society recovers from severe shock, but there is always a threshold beyond which recovery becomes uncertain. North Sentinel's strength lies in continuity. Its danger lies in the fact that continuity can be broken. Climate change adds a slower pressure, less visible than a boat on the reef, but potentially more relentless. Low islands and coastal forests are sensitive to sea level rise, storm surge, saltwater intrusion, coral stress, and changing weather patterns. North Sentinel has survived great waves and shifting shores before, but the pace and combination of modern changes may be different. Warmer seas can damage coral reefs. Stronger or more unpredictable storms can alter beaches. Saltwater can affect freshwater sources. Changes in fish populations can ripple into food security. The evidence remains incomplete for the island itself because direct study is limited, but the regional risks are real enough to matter. A people may keep outsiders away and still be touched by the carbon burned far beyond the horizon. There is a bitter irony in that. The Sentinelese have contributed almost nothing to the industrial processes changing the planet, yet their island is not exempt from the consequences. They do not operate factories, fly commercial routes, run container ports, or consume energy at modern urban scales. Still, the atmosphere does not respect cultural boundaries. The ocean does not stop warming at an exclusion zone. A society can refuse globalization politically and still face globalization chemically, climatically, and ecologically. This may be one of the deepest injustices surrounding North Sentinel. The outside world can harm the island without ever stepping ashore. Attention itself has become another threat. The more famous North Sentinel becomes, the more people imagine it. Some imagine it responsibly, as a place whose people deserve distance. Others imagine it as a challenge, a forbidden adventure, a spiritual target, a mystery to film, or a symbol to be used in arguments about civilization. In the age of instant media, fascination can become pressure. A story travels, a video circulates, a myth grows. Someone decides the law does not apply to them. Someone believes they're different from the outsiders who came before. Someone thinks history will forgive the trespass if the footage is remarkable enough. This is why the island's mystery must be handled carefully. Curiosity is not wrong. It is natural to wonder how the Sentinelese live, what language they speak, what they remember, how they survived the tsunami, how they teach children, what they believe about the sea and sky. But curiosity becomes dangerous when it demands satisfaction. The unknown around North Sentinel is not an abandoned room. It is an occupied home. The difference matters. To look toward the island with respect is one thing. To treat it as a puzzle owed to the world is another. The law can reduce these risks. But law is only as strong as enforcement and public understanding. Patrol boats can deter illegal fishing. Courts can punish unauthorized contact. Governments can restrict travel and discourage sensationalism. But the protective system also depends on a shared ethic. The recognition that leaving the sentinelese alone is not neglect, it is care. That ethic must be renewed because each generation encounters the island first as a story, and stories can be twisted. If the story becomes the dangerous tribe, fear may justify aggression. If it becomes the lost tribe, pity may justify intervention. If it becomes the untouched tribe, romanticism may justify preservation as spectacle. The better story is simpler and harder. They are people, and they have refused entry. There are also threats from beyond direct human intention. Marine pollution can drift in. Plastics can reach remote beaches. Fishing pressure outside the protected zone can affect regional ecosystems. Changes in policy, budget, or political will can weaken protection. A future government might decide that development, tourism, or strategic interest deserves priority. That may seem unlikely under current protective principles, but history warns against assuming restraint is permanent. Many indigenous lands were protected on paper before they were opened in practice. The sentinelese are safe only as long as the surrounding society continues to value their distance more than its own curiosity or profit. The fragile edge of North Sentinel is therefore both physical and moral. Physically, it is the reef, the beach, the forest margin, the zone where boats must not pass. Morally, it is the line between concern and intrusion, between knowledge and violation, between protection and possession. Holding that line requires discipline from people who will never be thanked by the sentinelese, never receive a treaty, never hear approval in a shared language. The reward is not gratitude. The reward is continued life on the island. And perhaps that is enough. Not every success in history has to be witnessed from inside. Not every protected future has to be documented in detail. A patrol that turns away a boat may preserve a story it will never read. A law that frustrates a traveller may prevent a fever no one will ever count. A decision not to land may be the most important human act in the entire relationship. The sentinelists have survived storms, empire, kidnapping, disease risk, wrecks, curiosity, and the great wave that remade shores across the region. Yet the future may test them in quieter ways: a warmer tide, a stranger's cough, a fishing boat at dusk, a policy neglected, a myth believed by someone with enough money to hire a boat. Their island is strong because it is defended. It is fragile because defense must never fail for long. At the edge of the reef, waves continue to fold over coral in white flashes. To the eye, the scene may look timeless. It is not. The sea is changing, the world is watching, and the island's survival depends not only on the people behind the trees, but on the restraint of everyone beyond the horizon. North Sentinel remains one of the last unentered doors, not because it is unknown to geography, but because it is unknown to power. The island has coordinates. It has a legal status. It appears on satellite images. It lies within a modern nation, inside a region shaped by naval routes, tourism, administration, and global attention. Yet the most important things about it remain closed: its language, its memories, its names for the sea, its stories of origin, its account of strangers, its griefs, its rules, its songs if songs are sung, its jokes if jokes are told, its explanations for why the beach must be defended. The door is visible. It is simply not ours to open. That is what makes the Sentinel's story so unusual in the history of exploration. Most mysteries of the human past are closed because time has destroyed them. Cities fall, scripts vanish, bones decay, forests cover ruins, rivers move, fires consume archives. The mystery of North Sentinel is different. It is not dead. It is alive, breathing, watching, choosing. The unknown survives not because evidence has disappeared, but because evidence belongs to people who have not agreed to share it. This kind of mystery demands a different response from the one archaeology often gives. It does not ask for excavation, it asks for restraint. For historians, the island complicates the usual story of civilization. The great narratives tend to move toward larger systems: farming, cities, states, writing, trade, empire, industry, and digital connection. These things are real and powerful, but they are not the whole human story. North Sentinel reminds us that survival can also mean remaining small, local, mobile, oral, and fiercely bounded. It reminds us that a people can possess no monuments and still inherit a deep past. It reminds us that history is not only what expands, it is also what endures. The Sentinelese have become symbols, whether they asked for it or not. To some, they symbolize human freedom. To others, danger. To others, the deep past, indigenous rights, anti-colonial resistance, or the limits of globalization. But symbols are risky because they flatten. The people on the island are not there to complete anyone's argument. They are not a lesson arranged for the modern world. They are a living community whose first concern is almost certainly not what outsiders think they represent. What survives in the record suggests a people defending home, adapting to change, and maintaining a boundary that has kept them alive. Scholars still debate their ancestry, numbers, language, and future vulnerability. The evidence remains incomplete, and it should remain incomplete unless the Sentinelese themselves someday choose otherwise. That possibility cannot be ruled out entirely. Cultures change, futures surprise. One generation may make choices another would not, but any future contact, if it ever occurs, would have to begin from their agency, not from outside desire. Until then, the most ethical form of knowledge is knowing where knowledge must stop. The legacy of North Sentinel is therefore not only about one island, it is about the world around it. It asks whether modern civilization can accept limits. It asks whether law can protect people who do not participate in law's language. It asks whether curiosity can mature into respect. It asks whether humanity's diversity includes the right to remain unreachable. No single explanation fully accounts for the Sentinel's endurance, because their survival is made from geography, history, ecological knowledge, trauma, adaptation, and choice. But the result is clear enough. Against immense pressure, the door remains closed, and behind it, life continues beyond the reach of narration. Smoke may rise through trees, canoes may slide through shallow water, children may learn the reef, elders may remember storms, someone may shape salvaged metal into a sharper edge, someone may watch the horizon and see, as generations before have seen, that the world beyond the sea is powerful, restless, and not always safe. The island does not need to explain itself to be real. Its silence is not absence, it is sovereignty. The tide keeps moving around North Sentinel. It moves without concern for maps, headlines, debates, or the long hunger of the outside world to know. It folds over the reef, withdraws from the sand, fills the pools, and returns again. From above, the island is small. From within, it is everything: forest, shore, shelter, danger, memory, and home. There is a strange comfort in accepting that some places remain unfinished in our understanding. So much of history reaches us through fragments anyway: a broken tablet, a buried hearth, a bone in a cave, a drowned coastline, a name preserved by strangers. North Sentinel offers different fragment, still alive and refusing to become evidence on anyone else's terms. It reminds us that human beings have not all walked the same road into the present, and that the roads not taken by empires are not empty roads. Perhaps the deepest lesson is humility. Civilizations rise believing they can measure the world. They build ships, then charts, then colonies, then satellites. They learn to see farther than any generation before them, and still a small island can remain beyond their rightful reach, not beyond sight, beyond permission. So the story ends where it began, at the edge of the water, a green island behind a pale reef, a horizon watched from both sides. The world outside continues to change, argue, warm, expand, and remember badly. The people within the trees continue, as far as anyone can know, to live by knowledge older than any written record of them, and more immediate than any theory about them. The mystery is not that they exist. The mystery is that they have been allowed, barely, imperfectly, to continue existing without being forced to become an answer. And in an age that enters almost everything, that may be one of the rarest survivals of all a human world still held behind distance, still guarded by sea and memory, still ending each day with the forest darkening, the reef whitening under the last light, and the island keeping its own name,